Good Thursday morning. 118 years ago today, at least according to Crowley's notes in the Equinox of the Gods, uh, even he didn't know exactly what happened. He met with, and then he put an Arabic squiggle, and even he confesses that his notes are probably purposeful blinds. So we don't have enough or very much to go on as we move our chronological timeline between the Supreme Invocation of Horus and the next notes that he puts in his diaries, which will be April 6th, which is just prior to the reception of the Book of the Law. So yesterday we were discussing the precession of the equinox of the gods, if you will, and we left off with my comments on it that I wrote in Understanding Aleister Crowley's Thoth Tarot, and where we actually discuss the different aeons, the aeons prior to this, and the possible meaning and the trajectory of human consciousness as it unfolds and manifests as what's known as magical aeons. Crowley taught that within our racial memory there have been 3 aeons. For literary convenience, he labeled them after the 3 principal gods of Egypt, the goddess Isis, her husband, brother Osiris, and their son Horus. We have just entered the Aeon of Horus, which supplanted the Aeon of Osiris, which supplanted the Aeon of Isis. Aeons changed not as the result of some war in heaven or astrological event, rather they're simply the consequence of some improved modification in human consciousness. Obviously, such mutations need to be universal and fundamental, something most of us share with our fellows, something as simple as how we perceive our relationship to the sun. Yes, it's as simple and as profound as that. And the Thoth Tarot, as much as any piece of art or literature, reflects the dynamics of this new evolutionary step. Let's look briefly at the last 2 aeons and see how our relative relationship to the sun has developed and how it affects the spiritual lives of our ancestors. The Aeon of Isis. The formula of the great goddess. It's impossible for us to pinpoint the dawn of the Aeon of Isis. Evidence of the worship of the great goddess is found as far back as the age of Leo. That's 10,000, almost 11,000 BC to 8,830 BC, if we're looking at it in astrological terms. In this period, when humanity was struggling with the first attempts at social intercourse, the most awesome mystery to excite the imagination was the power of woman. More than any other observable phenomena, woman was the most godlike. Each month, coinciding with the rhythm cycles of the moon, she issued blood. Yet miraculously, she did not die. When the cycle of bleeding stopped, her body changed. Her breasts and belly swelled for 9 moons until she burst with water and new life. Because the earliest Icean agers were as yet unaware of the cause and effect relationship between sex and birth, it appeared that woman alone was the source of human life. Her life-giving powers were not limited to blood and birth, for from her breasts flowed milk, a rich white blood to nourish and sustain the new life she created. Woman was the human embodiment of earth itself, which appeared to spontaneously bring forth vegetation and animals needed to sustain the race. It was the most self-evident fact of life. Earth was mother. Mother was life, God was woman. To be in harmony with the formula of the great goddess was profoundly simple, and as long as it was universally perceived that life and nourishment came directly from the earth and from woman, all successful endeavors, magical practices, and religious expressions did her homage. So deeply was this perceived reality impressed upon our ancestors' minds that long after they solved the mystery of where babies came from, they clung tenaciously to the outward forms of goddess worship and based all social and religious institutions on her formula. Evidently, however, as our understanding of the universe around us grew, we were confronted with a more complicated worldview and new unsettling mysteries. I have to add here, in my digression, that as the formulas change and evolve, they're not completely tossed out. The formula, the great goddess, still works. It's still a valid formula. It's just not the it is not the predominant formula. As I want to say, don't throw the baby Jesus out with the bathwater. Oh, but we'll talk about the baby Jesus right now. The Aeon of Osiris, the formula of the dying god. Even though the formula of the dying god became crystallized in the religions and institutions of the astrological age of Pisces, which is about 166 BC to around 2000 AD. The Aeon of Osiris dawned much earlier. The advent of agricultural societies necessitated a greater awareness of the cycles of the seasons. Osirian age farmers began to recognize the effects of sunlight or lack of it upon vegetation. I always want to say vegetarian. I wonder why. They observed that at certain times of the year, the days grew short and the crops did not grow. It eventually became evident that even though the earth brought forth life and the supreme creative energy that vivified that life came from the sun. Coincidental with this discovery was a universal acknowledgement of the vital role men played in the procreative process. Just as plant life needed the warm, penetrating rays of sunlight to flourish, so too woman needed the introduction of the male sperm to avoid being forever barren. The heretofore unrecognized concept of fatherhood became a dominant theme. The Aeon of Osiris truly began when our forebears raised their eyes to heaven and woke up to the fact that life on earth was a partnership of the sun and the earth. And that the life of the race was perceived as being a partnership of man and woman. However, the partnership was not perceived as being equal. The male backlash was severe and unmerciful. Deity was now male, a father in his prime, and was likened to that of the sun. Even though this shift of consciousness was the result of a more accurate assessment of the facts of life than was realized in the Aeon of Isis, it was not quite accurate enough. A defect in the perception of cosmological facts plunged our Osirian Age ancestors into a dark and terrifying insecurity crisis that traumatized the human race so severely that we still suffer from it. This fundamental flaw in understanding caused us to switch our focus from the mystery of where life comes from to an obsessive preoccupation with death. The tragic misunderstanding focused on the belief that each day the sun was born at dawn in the east and died in the evening in the west. Speculations abounded about where the dead sun went during the darkness of night, and if indeed a new sun would ever appear in the east. Perhaps it went to the land of the dead, where we temporarily visit during our nightly little sleep of death, of sleep. Our little death of sleep. Excuse me. The terrors and ecstasies of our dreams form the archetypes of heaven and hell. And after we die, who better to judge our worthiness for either place than the dead sun itself, who created and sustains us during our stay on earth? This is precisely the part the god Osiris would play in Egyptian mythology and Christ's role in Christianity. To further complicate these fears, the sun's yearly escapades caused an even greater insecurity crisis. Each year, at the zenith of the sun's power in summer, it was observed that each day it rose a little and set a little further south. This is from observers in the northern hemisphere. A little further south of where it did the day before. Around harvest time, the days grew noticeably shorter, and the specter of the empty, harvested fields accented the leafless trees and browning grasses and painted a melancholy and frightening portrait of nature in articulo mortis. It was unsettling enough to have the sun completely disappear each day, but if it continued to head south until night was perpetual, how long could the world survive in the cold darkness before a new sun appears? Sort of like the situation in Game of Thrones, when there's the long night. When the White Walkers, well, never mind. You don't know what fear is, little prince. In an attempt to calm the shattered nerves caused by such musings, a few wise souls took a deep breath and attempted to look at the big picture. Yes, the sun dies every evening in the west, but years of observation and the testimony of the oldest members of society indicated that a new one indicated that no one could remember a time when another one did not come up in the east within a relatively short time. Yes, the sun becomes weak and almost dies each year, but the same observations and testimony reveal that it eventually reverses its journey south, and the days grow longer and longer again until a new cycle of life returns to the earth. Based on the best information at their disposal, they concluded that magical power, an unknown and supernatural force, was responsible for the sun's resurrection. They further surmised that the secret of this magic must be hidden in the very nature of the sun itself. And if they could only harmonize with that nature, then perhaps they too could overcome death. Everywhere they looked in nature, they saw the sun's cycle of birth, life, death, and resurrection. They saw that cycle reenacted. They observed that plants sprouted to the surface in spring and grew tall and strong in the long days and warm sunlight of summer. Then in autumn, at the height of their maturity, they put forth seeds and then died, or were cut down at harvest time. Like the earth itself, the seeds lay dead and buried throughout the lifeless winter, only to spring to life when the rains and the lengthening rays of the sun transformed the soil into a moist, warm womb. They also observed the accelerated plant growth near the decaying remains of animals or people, wherever large amounts of blood spilled on the ground. This wonder was the male solar counterpart of the female lunar mystery of menstruation. The parallels between the sun and phallus, sunlight and semen, the fertilizing power of semen had upon woman, and that blood had upon the earth, did not escape our Osirian ancestors' fertile imaginations. A new fact of life, one that conformed to the secret nature of the sun, became the magical formula of the Aeon. Life comes from death. In order to harmonize with the new formula, it would become necessary to take an active role in the great death-life drama. For the earliest members of the Aeon of Osiris, human sacrifice was the supreme pantomime of the sun's daily and yearly sacrifice to the earth. And please recall, this was happening all over the globe. In the Americas, in Europe, in Asia. It also illustrated the sacrifice of the potency of the phallus after ejaculation, and the seed's sacrificial death, burial, and resurrection. The spilling of human blood in the unsown or newly planted field resulted in a noticeable increase in the fecundity of the harvest. The most comforting benefit derived from such bloody forms of religious expression was the undeniable fact that as long as they continued the sacrifices, the sun always came up in the morning and always stopped its journey south and returned to bring spring and summer. This put a tremendous amount of power in the hands of the priests or priestesses who wielded the sacrificial blade. They positioned themselves between the people and the gods and implied that personal responsibility for rebirth of the sun. I made it happen because I kill people every day. Keep giving me tithes, please. With each dawn, they became demonstrably more powerful. At regular intervals, all over the world, the ceremonial slaughter of the divine king assured a bountiful harvest and the well-being of the people. Even though the future victim was titular head of state, he was not ruler in the modern sense. He was the living embodiment of the sun and therefore supreme monarch of the earth. His periodic murder and coronation of his successor were occasions of great solemnity. In the waning years of the Aeon of Osiris, the character of the sacrifice evolved from human blood to animal blood to bread and wine. Among the more mystically inclined, sacrifice became a personal and transcendent experience. Nevertheless, such changes did nothing to disturb the basic magical formula of the Aeon of Osiris. The cycle of birth, life, death, and resurrection remained the dominant theme right up to the time of the magical revival of the late 19th century. By this time, however, the old formula was no longer based upon misinformation. It was built upon denial. And finally, just a few words about the Aeon of Horus, the formula of the crowned and conquering child. Long after our Icean Age ancestors solved the reproductive mysteries, they continued to cling to the magical formula that originated at a time when it was believed that life came spontaneously from woman and the earth. So too in the Aeon of Osiris, long after it was common knowledge that the earth revolves around the sun, and the great religious and political institutions continued to be obsessed with death and resurrections as if they still believed that the sun died every day. Today, the scientific truths of our heliocentric solar system have become an unquestioned reality for all but the most isolated or mentally disenfranchised inhabitants of our planet. For hundreds of years, mothers have assured their little ones at bedtime that the sun is not gone, but only shining on the other side of the world. It is this simple, reassuring truth that is the key to the formula of the Aeon of Horus. Not a formula of nourishment, not a formula of life, catastrophe, and resurrection, but a formula based upon the magic of continuous growth. In the Aeon of Isis, we identified with the earth. Life came miraculously from the earth and woman. All magical pantheons were aspects of the goddess. Death was a mystery whose depths were impossible to plumb. In the Aeon of Osiris, we identified with the dying resurrected sun. All magical pantheons were aspects of God, the Father. Death could be magically overcome by obedience to formula, rites, and doctrines. In the Aeon of Horus, we identify with the self-radiant, ever-living sun. All magical pantheons have become aspects of ourselves. We, like the sun, do not die. Death, like night, is an illusion. Life is seen as a process of continual growth, and humanity is developing a consciousness of the continuity of existence that will eventually dissolve the sting of death. So, that's my words of wisdom about the magical aeons, of which we're discussing the opening acts of the Aeon of Horus. I want to read something that might be a bit, where did it go? Perhaps when I was reading the Aeon card. Let's see if I can find it now. Yeah, Crowley ended his discussion, and now I'm reading from, I'm still reading from this. Crowley ends his discussion of the Aeon card with a comparison of the world events and approximate of approximately 2,000 years ago and the advent of the birth of the last Aeon. Okay, what does all this new Aeon stuff mean to us? This morning I posted on Facebook sort of the opening frontispiece quote from Angels, Demons, and Gods of the New Millennium. The gods of one age become the devils of the age to follow. The priests look forward to the coming age and see only the end of the world. And then I pose the question, what world is ending right now? Crowley ends his discussion with this card with a comparison of world events of approximately 2,000 years ago at the advent of the birth of the last Aeon. His words carry a chilling but ultimately hopeful message. The time for the birth of an Aeon seems to be indicated by great concentration of political power with the accompanying improvements in the means of travel, communication, with a general advance in philosophy and science, with a general need of consolidation of religious thought. It is very instructive to compare the events of the 500 years preceding and following the crisis of approximately 2,000 years ago, with those of similar periods centered in 1904 of the old era. It is, though far from comforting to the present generation, that 500 years of dark ages are likely to be upon us. But if the analogy holds, that is the case. Fortunately, today we have brighter torches and more torch bearers. And that is something to think about as we ponder our present situation and the apocalyptic circumstances that we find ourselves in. Yes, it does look like the age is changing. But I'm not sure it's going to be an overnight event. And it's likely that we're in for a bumpy ride. But as Crowley says, at least now we have more torches and more torch bearers. Until tomorrow, continue continue to be good to yourself and be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.